My father looked me dead in the eye at his own 40th wedding anniversary dinner and told me, in front of the waiter still holding the champagne bottle, that I would not be getting on that plane to Maui with the rest of the family because, in his exact words, "You don't belong with us, Elena. You never have." $41,000. That is what the Hale family had already spent on a 5-bedroom oceanfront villa at the Kaanapali Beach Club. Non-refundable, booked for 11 people, and I was not one of them. I was 34 years old, a licensed forensic accountant with a corner office at Voss & Kessler Financial Integrity Group, and my own father had just informed me, at 8:47 on a Tuesday night, that my job for the coming week was to stay behind in Ohio and babysit my sister's 3 children, while everyone else boarded a 6 a.m. flight out of Columbus. If you're watching this from your car in a parking lot on your lunch break, or curled up in bed with the lights off so nobody bothers you, comment the city you're in right now, because by the end of this video, you are going to want to tell somebody what you just watched happen to a family that thought money could buy silence. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been the one who paid for everything and got invited to nothing, because what I said back to my father that night, at that table, in front of all of them, is the reason 3 people in my family are not sleeping in their own beds tonight. I want you to understand the shape of what I'm about to tell you, because it comes in 3 pieces, and none of them resolve the way you think they will. The first piece is money. 2 years before that dinner, my father, Richard Hale, 66 years old, semi-retired owner of Hale Precision Tooling, a manufacturing company my grandfather built from a single lathe in a garage in Dayton, had come to me with tears in his eyes about a family trust. He told me the company was struggling, that my late grandmother's estate, the estate that included a $2.3 million trust meant to be split eventually between me, my sister Jessica, and my brother Tyler, needed temporary restructuring to keep the business afloat and protect all our futures. He asked me, because I was the one with the CPA license and the forensic accounting background, to sign off on moving trust assets into a new holding vehicle he and my brother-in-law Chad Byrne had set up, something called Hale Family Ventures LLC. I signed it. I trusted him. That was Loop A, and I did not know yet that the signature on that transfer document authorizing the second and third tranches, dated 14 months later, was not mine at all. It was a forgery so good that even I, a woman who catches forged signatures for a living, needed 3 passes under a loop and a stroke pressure analysis to prove it wasn't me. The second piece is my marriage. My husband, Marcus Cross, 36, ran what he called a boutique consulting practice out of a rented office above a dry cleaner's on High Street, a business that had billed, by my own reconciliation of our joint bank statements, exactly 4 clients in 11 months for a combined $19,000, against expenses, country club dues, a leased BMW X5, bespoke suits from a tailor in Cincinnati, of over $80,000 a year. I was the one who made partner track money. I was the one who quietly covered the difference every month, through an account Marcus didn't know I monitored line by line, because monitoring lines is what I do. What I did not know, not yet, was that Marcus had a second phone, a prepaid one, charging every night behind a shoebox of old tax returns in the hall closet, and that the number he texted most often, 41 times in the 2 weeks before that anniversary dinner, belonged to my own sister Jessica. That is Loop B, and it does not crack open the way you expect. The third piece is the plan nobody in my family thought I was capable of making, because for 34 years I had been the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got handed the bill and the diaper bag and the seating chart, while everyone else got handed the passport and the piña colada. Loop C is the answer to a question my father asked me once, mockingly, over that same anniversary dinner table, 3 drinks in. What are you even going to do about it, Elena? I am going to tell you exactly what I did about it. But first you need to understand how a family gets to a dinner table like that one, because nothing about that Tuesday night was sudden. It had been built, plank by plank, for 11 years. I need to take you back to the wedding, not my parents' 40th, my own, 7 years before that dinner, on a Saturday in June at a vineyard outside Yellow Springs that my husband's mother insisted wasn't nearly grand enough for a cross, though the crosses, as I would later document down to the decimal, had a combined net worth of $11,400 in a joint checking account and a house 2 payments from foreclosure. Marcus proposed to me in my second year of graduate school, when I was studying for the CPA exam and living on ramen and adjunct teaching stipends, and everyone in my family treated the engagement like I had finally, at 27, done something right. My mother, Diane Hale, 62, a woman whose entire identity was constructed from the invisible scaffolding of other people's approval, the right country club, the right stationery for her Christmas cards, the right seating arrangement at her book club, cried actual tears of relief when Marcus proposed, and I understood only years later that those were not tears of joy for me. They were tears of relief that her plain, serious, unglamorous daughter, the one who read spreadsheets for fun and had opinions about depreciation schedules at Thanksgiving, had somehow landed a handsome, charming, country club-adjacent man who made my mother's friends say, "Oh, Diane, he's just wonderful," at the holiday parties where appearances were the only currency that mattered. My sister, Jessica Hale-Byrne, 38, 4 years my senior, had a different reaction entirely. Jessica had been the golden child since the day I was born. Captain of the dance team, homecoming court, the one whose report cards got magneted to the refrigerator while mine got filed in a drawer because gauze, as in AP statistics, were, in my mother's words, not the kind of thing people want to talk about at parties. Jessica married Chad Byrne, 39, a man who sold commercial real estate with the specific, aggressive optimism of someone who had never actually closed a deal larger than a strip mall nail salon, and who nonetheless drove a leased Cadillac Escalade and referred to himself, unprompted, as a bit of a shark. When I got engaged, Jessica hugged me at the family dinner where we announced it, and then, not 40 minutes later, in the kitchen where she thought no one could hear her, told my mother, "I just hope Elena doesn't think this makes her interesting now." I heard every word. I said nothing. That was, I would come to realize, the entire operating manual for how I survived my family for over a decade. I heard everything, and I said nothing, and I filed it away the way I file away every anomaly in every ledger I have ever audited. Not to forget it, but to wait for the moment when the pattern would matter. My brother Tyler Hale, 31, the baby of the family, had never held a job longer than 8 months in his entire adult life, a fact my parents described exclusively in the passive voice. Tyler's between opportunities, Tyler's exploring his options, Tyler's just waiting for the right fit. As though employment were something that happened to Tyler, rather than something Tyler needed to pursue. Tyler lived, at 31 years old, in the finished basement of my parents' house on Foxcroft Lane, a 9-bedroom, low-slung stone colonial my father had built in 2003, with money that, I would later prove in a spreadsheet with 41 supporting exhibits, had never actually existed in the amounts he claimed. Tyler's monthly allowance from my parents, they called it a stipend while he found his footing, was $1,800, an amount that came, I would discover, directly out of the Hale Family Ventures LLC operating account, the same account that held what remained of my grandmother's trust. For years, I told myself the imbalance in my family was just personality, just birth order, just the ordinary unfairness that exists in every family where one child is easy to love loudly and another is easy to love quietly, in a lower register, in the kind of love that shows up as being asked to co-sign a loan rather than being asked how your day was. I told myself this at my grandmother's funeral, when my father stood up to deliver the eulogy and thanked Jessica and Tyler, the joy of my life, and did not say my name at all, not once, in 11 minutes, though I was the one who had spent every Sunday afternoon for the last 2 years of my grandmother's life sitting with her at Brookmere Assisted Living, reconciling her Social Security statements against her nursing home bill because the facility had been quietly overcharging her by $400 a month, and nobody else in my family had thought to check. I told myself this the year my father asked me, not Jessica, not Tyler, to review the company's books just as a formality. Honey, you know how these things work. And I found, in 11 hours of unpaid Saturday labor, a $9,000 bookkeeping error that would have cost the company its line of credit at renewal. My father took the credit for catching it in a meeting with the bank. I sat in the back of that meeting, in a folding chair near the door, and said nothing, because saying something, in my family, always cost more than staying quiet. The years compress the way years do when you are the responsible one in a family that runs on unspoken debts. I made partner track associate at Voss & Kessler at 29, the youngest in the firm's history to be fast-tracked into forensic litigation support, testifying as an expert witness in 3 federal fraud cases by the time I was 32, work that paid me, by the year of that anniversary dinner, $218,000 in salary and performance bonus, a fact my family knew in the vaguest possible terms. Elena does something with numbers for the government sometimes, was how my mother described my career to her book club, because specificity in my family was reserved for the achievements that photographed well. Meanwhile, Marcus's consulting practice limped along on my income, and my parents' precision tooling company, which I now understand was hemorrhaging money from a combination of Tyler's allowance, Chad's advisory retainer of $4,000 a month for real estate advice nobody had asked for, and my father's own increasingly reckless bets on aging machinery he refused to replace, kept its lights on through a trust that was legally, on paper, half mine. The man who taught me everything I know about reading a ledger the way other people read a face was Gerald Voss, 71 years old, founding partner of Voss and Kessler, a retired special agent who had spent 19 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before opening a private practice that consulted for exactly the kind of federal prosecutions he used to run from the inside. Gerald hired me straight out of my master's program because, he told me later, I was the only candidate in 40 interviews who, when handed a set of deliberately manipulated financial statements as a test, did not just find the manipulation. I reconstructed, unprompted, the psychological profile of the person who had committed it, noting in my write-up that the perpetrator appears to alternate between overconfidence and panic, visible in the timing of the adjusting entries, which cluster suspiciously around the 15th of each month, suggesting a mortgage or alimony payment driving the fraud. Gerald kept that write-up in a frame on his office wall for 6 years. He used to tell junior associates, Elena doesn't find fraud, fraud finds her, because she's the only one in the room who's actually paying attention. He would say this proudly, not knowing that the sharpest instrument I owned, my own attention, honed for 11 years on other people's families, had never once, not fully, been turned on my own. It started, the turning, on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 9 months before that anniversary dinner. I was reviewing my grandmother's original trust documents for an unrelated reason. My accountant had asked for basis information ahead of tax season, and I noticed, almost as an afterthought, that the corpus of the trust as originally funded in 2011 had been listed at $2.3 million, but the most recent K-1 I'd received from Hale Family Ventures LLC showed a total asset value of $680,000. I sat with that discrepancy for 11 days before I said anything to anyone, because I have learned, in my career, that the worst thing you can do with a number that doesn't reconcile is panic before you understand what happened to it. Numbers don't lie, but they don't confess either. You have to interrogate them the way you'd interrogate a witness, patiently, from the outside in, assuming nothing. I called my father on a Sunday, casually, the way you'd ask about the weather, and asked whether the trust had made any distributions I wasn't aware of. He laughed, an actual laugh, warm and easy, the laugh he used at Rotary Club meetings, and said, Elena, honey, you worry about other people's money for a living. Let your old man handle the families. I let it go. That is the sentence I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the sentence every single person in my family used, in one form or another, every time I asked a direct question for the next 9 months. Let your old man handle it. Don't worry your pretty head, this isn't your department, trust me. 4 different phrases, 1 function. Keep the forensic accountant away from the books. But keeping a forensic accountant away from the books is, itself, a data point. In my professional life, when a client's family suddenly develops an allergy to transparency around a specific set of assets, that allergy is the single most reliable predictor of fraud I have ever encountered. More reliable than missing receipts, more reliable than round number transactions, more reliable than even the classic tells like reluctance to use a particular vendor. Resistance to scrutiny is not neutral. It is data. And by May, 4 months before the dinner, I had enough data points accumulating in a manila folder I kept in a locked drawer at my office, not at home, to know that something in my family's finances had gone from careless to deliberate. The second thread, the marriage thread, started to fray around the same time, though I did not yet connect it to the first. Marcus had begun taking calls in the garage, door shut, engine of the leased BMW running, for reasons he explained as better reception out there. Which was, I noted even then with the part of my brain that never fully turns off, objectively false, since our house had a cell signal booster installed in 2019 that guaranteed 5 bars in every room, including the basement. He started coming home smelling of a perfume that was not mine. A warm vanilla and tobacco scent I recognized. With a jolt, I didn't let myself examine for another 6 weeks, as the exact fragrance Jessica had worn to our mother's 60th birthday party. A custom blend from a boutique perfumer in Cincinnati that she'd once described to me, unprompted and at length, as the only scent that actually smells expensive instead of just pretending to. I remember standing in my own kitchen at 11:40 on a Thursday night, Marcus already asleep upstairs, running my finger along the collar of the shirt he'd worn that day, and thinking, I am a forensic accountant. I find patterns for a living. I am choosing right now not to find this one. I started the investigation the way I start every investigation, which is to say quietly and from the outside. I did not pull a single internal document from Hale Family Ventures LLC in those first weeks. Instead, I went to the Montgomery County Recorder's Office and pulled every publicly filed lien, deed transfer, and UCC financing statement associated with my father's name, Chad Burns' name, and the LLC itself, going back 6 years. What I found on a gray Tuesday in April, sitting alone at a microfiche terminal because the county's digitization project hadn't reached filings before 2019, was a UCC-1 financing statement filed 18 months earlier, listing Hale Family Ventures LLC as debtor and a company called Meridian Bridge Capital as secured party, against collateral described as all present and future distributions from the Eleanor R. Hale Family Trust. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. Nobody had ever mentioned a loan against her trust to me. Nobody had ever mentioned Meridian Bridge Capital to me at all. I spent the better part of 3 weekends tracing Meridian Bridge Capital, using nothing but public filings and the kind of patient, boring, unglamorous searching that never makes it into movies about fraud investigators. Secretary of State corporate registration lookups, a UCC search in Delaware, cross-referencing registered agent addresses. Meridian Bridge Capital, LLC, it turned out, had been registered in Delaware 14 months before the UCC filing by a registered agent service at an address that also happened to be the registered agent for 11 other shell companies, 4 of which had been dissolved within 2 years of formation, a pattern that, in my professional experience, is about as close to a neon sign reading predatory lending vehicle as public records ever get. The listed manager of Meridian Bridge Capital was a name I did not recognize. Foster Greco. I ran that name against every database I had access to through my firm, LexisNexis public records, court dockets, professional licensing boards, and found that Foster Greco had, 6 years earlier, had his real estate broker's license suspended in the state of Florida following a civil judgment for what the state board's order called material misrepresentation in a private lending transaction. I printed that order, I put it in the folder. I did not yet know how Foster Greco connected to my family, only that he did, and that whatever connected him had been structured to look, on the surface, exactly like a legitimate business loan. It took another 5 weeks. Evenings after Marcus went to bed, a Saturday I told him I was catching up on filings at the office, before I found the connective tissue. Chad Byrne, my brother-in-law, the self-described shark who'd never closed a deal bigger than a strip mall, had a LinkedIn profile, sloppily maintained, that still listed a prior position from 9 years earlier, Junior Associate, Greco Capital Partners, Tampa, Florida, 2015 to 2017. Chad had worked for Foster Greco. Chad had, in fact, according to a since-deleted but still cached version of Greco Capital's old website that I pulled from the Wayback Machine at 1:15 in the morning on a Sunday, been listed as Director of Client Relations at the exact company whose principal had lost his license for defrauding private lenders. And Chad was the one who had personally introduced my father to an incredible financing opportunity. Rich, seriously, this guy's connections could triple what the trust throws off. At a 4th of July barbecue 3 years before the anniversary dinner. I remember that barbecue. I remember Chad standing by the grill with a beer in his hand, telling my father, in the particular tone entitled, "Men use when they want to sound like they're doing you a favor. You don't get access to guys like Foster without a personal introduction, Rich. I'm putting my own reputation on the line for you here." My father, flattered, grateful, desperate to believe his son-in-law had connections that mattered, signed the initial financing agreement with Meridian Bridge Capital 4 months later, pledging future trust distributions as collateral against a $200,000 bridge loan that was supposed to modernize 2 CNC machines on the tooling company floor. The loan was never used to modernize any machines. I found that out from the company's own equipment ledger, which I was eventually able to review under the pretext of helping Dad get organized for the accountant, and which showed no capital equipment purchases of any kind in the 18 months following the loan's disbursement. $200,000 had gone into the Hale Family Ventures LLC operating account, and had then, over the following 11 months, been drawn down in amounts that formed their own pattern once I laid them out on a timeline. $41,000 to a consulting fee paid to Chad Byrne personally, $18,600 in installments of exactly $1,800 to my brother Tyler, labeled in the ledger as family stipend, $62,000 transferred to an account in my mother's name alone, an account I would later learn funded, among other things, the $62,000 renovation of my parents' kitchen, complete with the wolf range my mother had wanted for a decade and had told her book club, without a trace of irony, Just fell into our laps, isn't that lucky? The rest, roughly $78,000, I could not trace through any legitimate expense category at all. It had simply left the account in 4 wire transfers to an account belonging to Foster Greco personally, not Meridian Bridge Capital, the entity. A detail that in forensic accounting is about as clear a signature of embezzlement through a loan structure as exists. Because legitimate loan proceeds don't wire back to the lender's personal account unless the loan was never really a loan at all. It was a mechanism for laundering money out of a trust while making the outflow look, on paper, like a liability rather than a theft. By July, 2 months before the dinner, I understood the shape of Loop A almost completely, though I would spend the following months building the evidentiary records strong enough to survive what I already knew, professionally, would eventually need to survive a courtroom. What I did not yet have was the forged signature, the second and third tranche authorizations that had gone out under my name without my knowledge, moving another $410,000 out of what remained of the trust between the loan closing and that July. I suspected the forgery. I had a professional's instinct for it. But suspecting is not proving, and I had built my entire career on the difference between the two. It was during this period that I had the conversation with Chad that I still turn over in my mind more than almost any other exchange in this entire story, because it was the moment I understood exactly what kind of man had been given access to my family's money. We were at my nephew's 7th birthday party, a bounce house and pizza affair in my sister's backyard, and Chad cornered me by the cooler, 3 beers in, and said, "Apropos of nothing, you know, Elena, some people in this family don't appreciate how much I've done for your dad. Foster's not just anybody." I put my whole reputation on the line, vouching for him. I asked, carefully, casually, what exactly Foster's firm specialized in. Chad puffed up. I watched it happen in real time, the specific physical inflation of a mediocre man being asked to describe his own importance, and said, "Alternative lending structures for family wealth preservation." "It's a very exclusive space. Most people don't even qualify." I asked how Chad had met him. Chad said, "We go way back, Tampa days. I basically trained under the guy." I already knew, from the cached website and the suspended license filing sitting in my locked drawer at the office, that Chad had been a junior associate for 2 years at a firm whose principal had been sanctioned for defrauding lenders, and that trained under the guy meant, in the plainest possible translation, learned the exact playbook I would later help my father-in-law walk into voluntarily. I smiled at Chad. I said, "That sounds like a great opportunity for Dad." Chad said, "Right? People sleep on me. They really do." He has said some version of that sentence to me at every family gathering for 6 years. He said it the last time I saw him too, though by then the sentence meant something very different. Because by then, people had stopped sleeping on him in the specific way that involves federal wire fraud statutes. Living a double life inside your own family is a specific kind of exhausting that I don't think people understand until they've done it. Every Sunday dinner at Foxcroft Lane, I sat across the table from my father, watching him carve the roast with the same steady hands he'd used to sign a forged distribution authorization in my name. And I asked about his golf game. Every phone call with my mother, I listened to her describe the new kitchen renovation, the wolf range, the quartz waterfall island, the "just fell into our laps" refrain. She repeated so often it started to sound, even to her, like something she needed to believe, rather than something that had happened. And I said, "That sounds beautiful, Mom," in a voice I had trained over 11 years of forensic depositions to give away absolutely nothing. My mother's entitlement had a texture to it that I cataloged the way I catalog everything, because it never varied, not once, across every interaction I can recall from childhood through that final dinner. It always arrived wrapped in the language of deserving. "We deserve this trip, Elena. Your father has worked so hard. I deserve a kitchen I'm not embarrassed to host in. Jessica deserves help with the kids. She's stretched so thin." This last one delivered to me directly, at a Tuesday lunch 4 months before the anniversary dinner, as the opening argument for why I, not Jessica's own mother-in-law, not a paid sitter, should be the one to watch Jessica's 3 children, just until things calmed down, during a period when Jessica had, in fact, taken up hot yoga 4 mornings a week and a standing Thursday spa appointment. Expenditures I knew about because Jessica had, without any apparent sense of the contradiction, complained to me at that same lunch about how insanely expensive her yoga studio's new membership tier was, $68 a month, while asking me to provide free childcare worth, by any market rate in our county, at least $20 an hour. I want to describe one specific Sunday dinner in detail, because it is representative of perhaps 40 others across that final year, and because the sameness of it is the point. It was the second Sunday in June, 3 months before the anniversary. I arrived at 6, as always, having left my own office at 4:30, after finishing a deposition summary for a federal case involving a construction contractor who'd been skimming from union pension funds. A case, I remember thinking with a kind of grim, private irony as I drove to my parents' house, that involved almost exactly the same mechanism Chad had used against my own family, just with different collateral. My mother met me at the door already talking, mid-sentence, about a friend's daughter's engagement party, the kind of conversational entry point designed to signal that whatever I might want to discuss was, by definition, less urgent than whatever she had already decided to discuss. My father was in the den watching golf with the sound off, a habit he'd had my entire life, the visual of the sport apparently sufficient without the commentary, a fitting metaphor, I've come to think, for a man who preferred the appearance of engagement to its substance, in almost every domain of his life. Tyler emerged from the basement at 6:40, 40 minutes after dinner had been called, wearing sweatpants and the specific, unhurried posture of a 31-year-old man who has never once in his life had a reason to hurry for anyone. Jessica arrived last, at 6:52, without her children. Chad's got them, I needed a night off, and immediately asked my mother whether there was wine before she'd taken off her jacket, before she'd said hello to anyone at the table, including me. The dinner conversation, as it did most Sundays, revolved entirely around Jessica's life. A renovation she and Chad were doing on their own house, funded, I now understood with total clarity, by the same well my father's business was being drained from. A disagreement Jessica was having with her homeowners association that my father promised, unprompted, to make a call about, using a connection from Rotary Club, an offer of institutional favor pulling he had never once extended on my behalf for anything, not even the year my own car had been towed from a spot I had a permit for, and I'd asked, half joking, whether he knew anyone at the city. He had laughed that time and said, "Elena, you're smart enough to handle a parking ticket." 40 minutes into that June dinner, my mother turned to me, the first direct question addressed to me all evening, and asked whether I could take the kids for a week in August, since you don't really have anything going on in the summer anyway. A sentence that assumed, with a carelessness I had stopped being surprised by but never stopped cataloging, that a woman testifying in 3 federal cases and managing a caseload of forensic litigation support work simply had nothing going on. I said yes. I want to be honest about that, on camera, because the version of this story where I heroically pushed back at every slight along the way would be a lie, and I don't tell lies, not even flattering ones about myself. I said yes to the kids in August. I said yes to hosting Thanksgiving the year Jessica just couldn't handle the stress, 4 months after her 3rd child was born, despite the fact that I had, that same November, closed out the largest engagement of my career, a multi-state Medicaid fraud case that required me to fly to Chicago twice in 10 days. I said yes because saying no, in my family, was treated not as a boundary but as an act of aggression, a betrayal of the unspoken agreement that Elena is the one who accommodates. I said yes because every single time I had ever tested that agreement, every time across 11 years that I had said, actually, I can't this time, I had been met not with understanding but with a specific weaponized disappointment, my mother's voice going soft and wounded, my father's silence stretching a beat too long before he changed the subject, a whole family choreography designed to make refusal cost more than compliance ever did. My father's arrogance operated on a different frequency than my mother's entitlement, though the two fed each other constantly. Where my mother's need was soft and performative, my father's was loud and structural. He needed, at all times, to be the smartest man in any room he occupied, a need that had curdled. Over 4 decades of running a company that increasingly could not survive without decisions he was no longer competent to make, into a kind of willful blindness toward anyone who might correct him. I watched him, at that same June dinner, wave off a comment from Tyler, one of the only times I ever saw Tyler venture an actual opinion at that table, about whether the company should look into automating a production line, dismissing it with, "Son, I built this business before you were born. I think I know a thing or two." He said something almost identical to me 11 months earlier, when I gently suggested, after reviewing the books just to help, that the company's debt service coverage ratio was getting uncomfortably thin, and that maybe now wasn't the time for additional borrowing. "Elena, I appreciate you looking things over, but this is a business that's been through recessions you don't remember. I think I can handle a loan. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said that. In the doorway of his home office, a folder of my own analysis in my hand, an analysis that turned out, 11 months later, to have understated the danger, not overstated it. He had waved away the one person in the family capable of seeing the fraud coming, precisely because acknowledging that I might see something he couldn't would have required him to admit a vulnerability his entire self-image could not accommodate. Jessica's opportunism showed up in smaller, sharper increments, almost surgical in their precision, always calibrated to extract exactly as much as she could without quite crossing into a request I could refuse without seeming petty. She never asked me for money outright. She was too careful for that. Or perhaps too aware that a direct request might trigger the kind of scrutiny she instinctively avoided. Instead, she asked for things adjacent to money. Could I look over Chad's business plan for a new venture, just so he feels supported? A business plan that turned out, when I actually read it at her request that September, to project 40% annual growth for a commercial real estate side fund with zero committed capital and a management team consisting entirely of Chad and a cousin of his who'd once flipped 2 houses. Could I recommend a tax strategy for their household? Since you're basically a genius at this. A request that, once fulfilled with actual professional-grade advice, worth, at my billing rate, at least $600, generated no thanks beyond, "You're the best, Lena," a nickname she used only when she wanted something and dropped the moment the transaction was complete. Could I just take a look at the trust distribution schedule and confirm everything looked right? A request she made exactly once, at a Christmas party 14 months before the anniversary dinner, in a voice so studiously casual that I noted it. Even then, filed it in the part of my mind that never stops running background checks on tone. Tyler's laziness was the least psychologically interesting of the 4, but the most expensive, in a strange, diffuse way. Not because Tyler took large sums directly, but because his $1,800 monthly allowance had become so normalized within the family's operating assumptions that nobody, including my father, seemed to register it as an outflow requiring justification anymore. It simply was, the way the mortgage was, the way the utility bill was, a fixed cost of the household budget that happened to be a 31-year-old man's continued failure to become an adult. I asked my father once, gently, during a period when I still believed gentle questions might produce honest answers, whether Tyler had any plan to move out, to get a job that lasted more than 8 months, to contribute anything at all. My father's answer has stayed with me. Tyler's sensitive. He's not built like you, Elena. Not everyone can just grind through things the way you do. I did not say, though I wanted to, that grinding through things was not a personality trait I had been born with. It was the only currency my family had ever accepted from me in exchange for love, and I had spent 34 years paying it in full, on time, every single time, while my brother lived rent-free in a basement funded by a stolen trust and was praised, in the same breath, for being sensitive. If you've made it this far, if you've ever sat at a table like the ones I just described and smiled through it, I want you to hit like right now, because what's coming next is the part where I stopped being the person who just files things away. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how a woman who spends her career catching other people's fraud finally turned that same unblinking attention on the 2 people closest to her. The affair announced itself in fragments, the way affairs almost always do to the person who isn't looking for it, because I wasn't looking for it, not directly. I was looking at the trust, at Meridian Bridge Capital, at Foster Greco's wire transfers, and the fragments about Marcus simply accumulated in the periphery of an attention I had turned elsewhere. The prepaid phone behind the shoebox of tax returns, the vanilla and tobacco perfume, Jessica's custom blend from the boutique in Cincinnati. A receipt I found, not through any deliberate searching, but because it fell out of Marcus's jacket pocket when I was taking it to the dry cleaner, for a room at the Kingsgate Marriott in Sharonville on a Tuesday afternoon in April, a hotel 11 miles from Marcus's office and exactly 4 miles from Jessica's Pilates studio, charged to a card I didn't recognize, $189, checkout at 3:47 p.m. I did not confront him that day. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't denial. It was strategy. The same strategy I apply to every case at Voss and Kessler, which is that you never tip your hand to a subject before you have enough corroborating evidence that a denial becomes impossible to sustain. I had learned that lesson the hard way, 4 years earlier, on a case involving a hospital administrator suspected of upcoding Medicare claims, where a junior associate on my team had confronted a suspect too early, on the strength of a single anomalous entry, and watched the entire paper trail get shredded within 48 hours. I was not going to make that mistake with my own marriage. So I did what I do professionally. I built a file, a real one, in a manila folder in the same locked drawer at my office where the Meridian Bridge Capital documents lived. Except this folder had a different label. Not HFV distributions, but personal. A euphemism even in my own private filing system. Because some part of me still couldn't write the word affair on a folder tab. Over the following 7 weeks, I documented 11 more instances. A Venmo payment from Marcus's personal account to a username I traced, through a public profile photo, back to Jessica, memo line reading only, lunch, $42, on a day I happened to know Jessica had told our mother she was getting her hair done all afternoon. A calendar entry on the shared family calendar Jessica still had access to from when she used to help coordinate our mother's medical appointments. An entry for J+M coffee. A detail so brazen in its carelessness that I understood, reading it, that neither of them had ever once considered the possibility that I was paying attention, because paying attention to my own life had never, in this family's operating model, been something I was expected or permitted to do. A pattern of Marcus's phone location, visible to me through a family location sharing app we'd set up years earlier for safety, showing his phone at Jessica's house on 4 separate weekday afternoons between 1 and 3. Hours during which Chad was reliably at his office and the children were reliably at school. Windows I mapped against Jessica's own calendar with the same methodical cross-referencing I'd use to establish a pattern of fraudulent transaction timing. The detail that finished building the file, the one I still cannot think about without a specific, cold stillness settling into my chest even now, came from the prepaid phone itself. I found it, finally, on a Saturday in July when Marcus had gone to play golf with 2 friends from the club. An activity that reliably took 4 hours and gave me, for the first time in months, uninterrupted access to the house. The phone wasn't password protected. Marcus, for all his careful curation of appearances, had never once imagined himself as a man whose wife might go looking, and that unearned confidence is, I have found, professionally and personally, the single most common vulnerability in every fraud I have ever investigated. The messages went back 14 months. They did not read like passion so much as like planning. Logistics mostly, coordinating windows of time, complaining about spouses in a shorthand so casual it was almost administrative. Jessica writing at one point, Diane's driving me insane about the gala seating chart. Can you believe she wants me sitting next to Aunt Carol? And Marcus responding, lol, tell her you'll sit wherever as long as it's not next to your sister. A joke about me. Made between the two of them, 4 months before I would find it, in a message thread I read standing in my own kitchen with my coat still on. There was one message, dated 8 months earlier, that told me everything I needed to know about the architecture of what I was dealing with. Jessica had written, sometimes I feel bad, you know? She's actually a good person. Marcus had responded, she's fine. She's just not built for the parts of life that are actually fun. You know that. I read that exchange perhaps 30 times over the following week. Not out of masochism, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that too, but because it was, in its way, the single clearest piece of evidence I had ever gathered in my career about how a family builds and sustains a hierarchy of who gets to matter. I was fine. I was not built for the fun parts. I was, in the assessment of my own husband, a person whose function was adjacent to real life rather than a participant in it. Useful, reliable, and fundamentally beside the point. I did not cry over that message, and I want to be precise about why. Because I think people expect a woman in my position to have broken down, and that expectation is itself part of what allowed this to go on as long as it did. Crying, in my family, had always been a currency my mother and sister spent freely, and that bought them accommodation, protection, softness from everyone around them. I had learned, very young, that my tears bought nothing, that a young Elena crying over being left out of something got told to stop being so sensitive, while a young Jessica crying over the exact same exclusion got the outcome changed to suit her. So I had stopped crying, functionally, sometime around age 11, and what I felt instead, standing in my kitchen with that message open on a screen in my hand, was something colder and more useful. Certainty. A clean, structural certainty that the family I had spent 34 years accommodating had never once, in any real sense, been mine to lose. Because you cannot lose a place you were never actually given. I went to Gerald Voss on the first Monday in August, 6 weeks before the anniversary dinner, and I did something I had never done in 9 years of working for him. I closed his office door, sat down without being asked, and said, Gerald, I need to talk to you about something that isn't a case file. Except it is. He listened to the entire thing: the trust, the UCC filing, Meridian Bridge Capital, Foster Greco's suspended license, Chad's history at Greco Capital Partners. And yes, eventually, because by then it was inseparable from the rest, the prepaid phone and the messages between Marcus and Jessica. Gerald did not say a single word for the first 11 minutes. When I finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt in the slow, deliberate way he did before delivering something important, and said, "Elena, I've watched you take apart cases for other families for 9 years without your hands shaking once. I need you to promise me you're going to run this exactly the way you'd run any other case. No shortcuts because it's personal, especially because it's personal." That promise became the operating discipline of the next 5 weeks. Gerald connected me with a forensic document examiner he'd worked with on federal cases for over 2 decades, a woman named Priya Anand who ran an independent lab in Columbus, and who had testified, Gerald told me, in over 200 cases involving question signatures without ever once having her methodology successfully challenged on appeal. I brought Priya the original 2011 trust documents bearing my authentic signature, 3 additional documents I'd signed for unrelated matters across the intervening years to establish a baseline of natural variation in my handwriting, and the 2 disputed distribution authorizations, the ones dated 14 and 19 months after the original financing agreement, the ones I had never seen before, finding them buried in a supplemental filing my father's attorney had, with what I can only assume was arrogant carelessness, included in a batch of documents he'd sent me for my records as part of an unrelated estate conversation, apparently never imagining I would actually read them line by line, because reading things line by line was, in my family's understanding of me, simply what I did for other people's money, never a threat that might turn inward. Priya's analysis took 19 days and produced a 41-page report I still have memorized in fragments. She identified 7 points of divergence between my authentic signature and the question signatures, including a subtle but consistent difference in the pen lift pattern between the E and the L in Elena, a stroke I execute apparently without lifting the pen at all, a habit formed, Priya told me, from decades of handwriting under time pressure during exam conditions, while the forged signature showed a clean lift and restart, the mark of someone tracing rather than writing. She also found, using a technique called electrostatic detection apparatus analysis on the physical document, indented writing on the page beneath the signature, faint grooves left by a pen pressing through from a sheet that had been placed on top during the forgery, grooves that spelled out, when developed, a partial practice attempt. The letters L, written 4 times in a row in a hand that was recognizably not mine, in a slant and pressure pattern that Priya's report matched, with what she characterized as a high degree of confidence, to a known writing sample of my father's own signature, obtained, with Gerald's guidance on the proper chain of custody, from a public document my father had signed and filed with the county 3 years earlier. My own father had practiced forging my signature 4 times on a piece of paper before executing it convincingly enough to move $410,000 out of a trust that was legally, in significant part, mine. I sat with Priya's report in my car in the parking lot outside her lab for 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home. Not crying. I want to be clear. I did not cry. But sitting in a stillness so total that Gerald, when I called him afterward, told me my voice sounded, in his words, like ice water, Elena, and I mean that as a professional compliment. The FBI contact was Gerald's, not mine, a former colleague from his 19 years in the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, a special agent named Marcus Delacroix, a coincidence of names that struck me as almost absurd the first time Gerald said it aloud. My husband and my avenue of justice sharing a first name, though I never once confused the 2 men, because Agent Delacroix, unlike my husband, was a person whose every word I could verify against documented fact. Gerald arranged an introductory meeting in September, 4 weeks before the anniversary dinner, at a nondescript coffee shop off I-75 rather than a federal building, because Gerald understood, in a way I was only beginning to, that a case involving your own family required more discretion than a case involving a stranger's. Agent Delacroix, 53, 22 years with the Bureau, specialized in wire fraud and financial exploitation of elderly and vulnerable trust beneficiaries. A specialization that, he told me within the first 10 minutes of our meeting, made my grandmother's trust exactly the kind of case his unit existed to pursue. Since Eleanor Hale had been 81 years old and suffering from early-stage vascular dementia at the time the second financing agreement with Meridian Bridge Capital was executed, a detail my father had never disclosed to anyone, including apparently his own attorney, but which I had documented from her Brookmere medical records I had legal access to as her financial power of attorney during her final 18 months. "This isn't just a civil trust dispute, Ms. Cross," Agent Delacroix told me, sliding a legal pad across the table with a list of statutes written in his own handwriting. "If the facts are what you're describing, we're looking at wire fraud, we're looking at exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and depending on what your document examiner's report shows, we may be looking at forgery in furtherance of a federal offense. This is a bureau case. You did the right thing bringing it to us instead of trying to handle it as a family matter." Building the case took the full 6 weeks, working nights and weekends around my existing caseload, because I would not allow Gerald or Agent Delacroix to see even a flicker of unreliability in the work I produced, not on this case above all others. I built a complete forensic timeline. Every dollar of the $200,000 Meridian Bridge Capital loan, traced from disbursement through 11 months of distributions, cross-referenced against Chad's, Tyler's, and my mother's personal bank statements, obtained through channels Agent Delacroix's investigation, authorized once the Bureau formally opened the file in late September. I built a complete communications record establishing Chad's prior relationship with Foster Greco, including a sworn affidavit request the Bureau ultimately didn't need, because Foster Greco, facing his own mounting legal exposure once the Bureau's subpoenas started reaching Meridian Bridge Capital's banking records, agreed, through his own attorney, to cooperate in exchange for consideration on unrelated matters already under investigation in the Southern District of Florida. And confirmed, in a recorded proffer session I was permitted to observe through one-way glass at the Federal Building in Cincinnati, that Chad Byrne had proposed the entire structure to him personally, describing my father as, in Foster's recollection of Chad's own words, "an easy mark, trusts the wrong people, doesn't read anything before he signs it." I want to tell you honestly that hearing those words, my father described by the very man defrauding him as an easy mark, produced in me a complicated, uncomfortable flicker of something almost like protectiveness, a reflex 34 years deep that I could not fully extinguish even by then, even knowing everything I knew. I did not act on that flicker. I have learned, across a career spent watching families destroy each other over money, that sympathy for a perpetrator's vulnerability is not the same thing as an argument for letting the perpetration continue, and my father, whatever his own vulnerabilities to men like Chad and Foster Greco, had chosen, with his own hand, to forge my signature 4 practice attempts deep before he got it right. Easy mark and forger are not mutually exclusive descriptions of the same man. The timing of the reveal became, in the final 2 weeks, a deliberate strategic decision rather than something that simply happened to coincide with the anniversary dinner. Agent Delacroix's team needed until early October to finalize the wire fraud charges and secure the necessary warrants. The 40th anniversary gala, a black tie fundraiser my parents had planned for 18 months at the Camden Country Club, benefiting the same Rotary Club charitable foundation my father chaired, fell on the second Saturday of October, drawing, by the final guest count, over 200 people, including the county prosecutor, 3 members of the club's board, my father's banker, and this detail mattered enormously to Agent Delacroix's team, though I did not fully understand why until later. Several individuals who had themselves invested personal funds in ventures Chad had promoted, using his family connection to my father's supposedly solvent, prestigious business as social proof, meaning the fraud, once exposed, would need to be exposed publicly enough to protect other potential victims from further exploitation, not just to satisfy any private sense of justice on my part. The gala was not a stage I chose for drama. It was the stage the investigation itself required, and I simply made sure I would be standing on it when the moment came. The Tuesday dinner I opened this story with, the one where my father told me I didn't belong with the family, the one where I first learned about Hawaii, happened on October 1st, 11 days before the gala, and I need to walk you through it in full now, because at the time I sat through it, I already knew everything I've just told you. I already had Priya's 41-page report. I already had Agent Delacroix's confirmation that arrest warrants were being finalized. I already knew with total certainty about Marcus and Jessica. I sat at that dinner table not as a woman blindsided by her family's cruelty, but as a woman who had spent 5 months building a case so thorough it could survive a federal courtroom, watching the people I was about to expose enjoy what I understood, with a clarity that still unsettles me slightly to describe, was very likely the last ordinary family dinner of their lives. We were at Bellamy's, a steakhouse my parents favored for family occasions specifically because the private dining room seated exactly 12 and made my mother feel, in her words, like we're the kind of family that has private dining rooms. The table that night held my parents, Jessica and Chad, Tyler, Marcus and me, and my mother's sister Carol with her husband, 8 of the 11 who would eventually be named on the Hawaii itinerary, the other 3 being Jessica's children who would be staying with a grandmother from Chad's side. A fact I only learned that night, watching the arrangements unfold across the table like a hand of cards being dealt without me. My mother announced the trip during the champagne toast, radiant, describing the villa in detail, the private lanai, the sunset views, the trip of a lifetime to celebrate 40 years, and the table lit up with the particular performative delight my family reserved for occasions where enthusiasm functioned as a kind of social obligation. I asked, when the flight itinerary came up, what time our flight left. I asked it plainly, without any edge, the way you'd ask a simple logistical question, because at that point I still, some small residual part of me, expected to be included. My father's answer landed in the exact cadence I described at the start of this story, and I want to describe his face as he said it, because I have thought about that face more than almost any other image from that entire year. He didn't look angry, he didn't even look particularly uncomfortable. He looked, if anything, mildly irritated at having to state something he clearly considered self-evident, the way you might look explaining to a child why the stove is hot. You aren't told since you don't belong with us. You will remain here to babysit all the children. The room did not go silent, not immediately. My Aunt Carol let out a small, nervous laugh, the kind people make when they're not sure if something is a joke. And my mother said, "Richard," in a warning tone that was not, I noted even in that moment, actually a defense of me, only a request that he phrase the exclusion more delicately in front of Carol's husband, who was not family, and might report back unflattering impressions to the country club social circuit my mother cared about. I said, into that small, uncertain silence, in a voice I kept level with an effort that cost me more than anyone at that table would ever know. That's interesting, because I didn't realize babysitting 3 children in Ohio required me to also fund the villa. I said it lightly, almost as a joke, watching my father's face for the reaction, and I got exactly what I expected. A flicker, fast, almost imperceptible if you didn't know to look for it, the specific flicker of a man who has just been reminded, in front of witnesses, that the money paying for his comfort has an origin he'd prefer nobody examine too closely. He recovered quickly. "Nobody's funding anything with your money, Elena. I don't know where you get these ideas," I said, still lightly, still smiling. "Must be a coincidence, then, that the trust distributions and the Hawaii deposit cleared the same week." I watched Chad's hand still, mid-reach, over the breadbasket. I watched Jessica's eyes flick, just once, toward Marcus, a look that lasted less than a second but told me everything about which secrets in that room she was actively managing in her head at that exact moment. My father said, "I don't know what you think you know, but this isn't the time." I said, "You're right, it isn't." And I let the subject drop, because I did not need that dinner to be the reveal. I needed that dinner to be the last night my family got to believe they were still ahead of me. The 11 days between that dinner and the gala were the longest of my professional life. Not because the investigation required anything further from me. By then the case file was complete, the warrants were being processed, Agent Delacroix's team had done a final round of confirmatory subpoenas on Meridian Bridge Capital's remaining banking activity. But because I had to continue functioning, daily, inside a marriage and a family I now understood with total clarity to be built on theft and betrayal, without giving either Marcus or my parents any reason to suspect the ground was about to open beneath them. I cooked dinner for Marcus on the Thursday before the gala. I sat across from him at our own kitchen table, the same table where I'd once stood examining the collar of his shirt for a perfume I didn't recognize, and I asked him about his day, and he told me without a flicker of hesitation about a client meeting that, I already knew from the billing records I'd continued to monitor, had never actually happened, because his consulting practice's calendar showed no scheduled appointments that Thursday at all. Only, according to the location data I still had access to, 3 hours spent at an address I had by then confirmed belonged to a house Jessica sometimes used for what she told our mother were solo decompressing days, a rental property in her own name that Chad, as far as I could determine, did not know existed. I helped my mother with gala seating arrangements over the phone that same week, listening to her fret over whether Aunt Carol should sit near the county prosecutor's wife, whether the head table should seat 12 or 14, whether the ice sculpture, an ice sculpture, For a Rotary Club charitable gala, 40 years married, $4,000, an expense I now recognized instantly as originating from the same Hale Family Ventures account that had once held my grandmother's trust, should be shaped like a swan or the number 40. I said the swan was more elegant. My mother agreed, delighted, and told me I had such good taste for these things, I don't know where you get it, a compliment so absurd in context, given everything I knew and everything she didn't, that I had to set the phone down for a moment after we hung up and simply breathe, alone in my kitchen, in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, less like waiting and more like the final held breath before a held note finally releases. Gerald called me the Wednesday before the gala with a piece of information that very nearly changed my composure for the only time in that entire 11-day stretch. Agent Delacroix's team, in the course of finalizing the warrants, had identified a fourth account connected to the fraud, a joint account in my father's and my mother's names, not previously flagged, that had received a wire transfer of $94,000 8 months earlier from a source the Bureau was still tracing, a transfer that had gone out again, in nearly the same amount, 3 weeks later, to an escrow account associated with a real estate closing. My mother, it turned out, was not simply an unwitting beneficiary of my father's arrangement with Chad and Foster Greco. She had personally directed the flow of that $94,000 into a down payment on a second property, a condominium in Naples, Florida, purchased quietly 11 months earlier and never once mentioned to me, to Tyler, or, as far as the Bureau could determine, to anyone outside my parents' own marriage, a private escape hatch my mother had apparently been building, in parallel with the very trust destruction she'd spent that same year insisting she knew nothing about. I sat with that information for a long time. It clarified something I had suspected but not fully confirmed, that my mother's performance of innocence, the wide eyes, the "I don't get involved in your father's business affairs, dear," the delighted ignorance about where the Wolf Range money had just fallen into their laps from, was not naivety. It was a choice, sustained deliberately, month after month, by a woman who knew exactly where the money was coming from, and had used the cover of feminine helplessness to build herself an exit, long before anyone else in the family even knew there was a fire to run from. The Camden Country Club ballroom on the night of the gala held 211 guests, round tables draped in ivory linen, the swan ice sculpture my mother had chosen glowing under a spotlight near the dessert station, a string quartet working through a set list heavy on the kind of music that exists to be background rather than heard. I arrived at 7, alone. Marcus had driven separately, claiming a late client call that I knew, from the location data, had actually been 90 minutes spent at Jessica's rental property, the two of them apparently unconcerned, by that point, with even the pretense of discretion, perhaps sensing on some animal level that something in their arrangement was accelerating toward an ending, though neither of them could have guessed the shape it would actually take. I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for that night, plain, well-tailored, nothing that would draw attention, because attention, that night, was not something I intended to generate through appearance. I checked my phone once, at 7:40, and found a single text from Agent Delacroix. "Team in position. We move at your signal, not before. Your call, Miss Cross." I remember reading that message standing near the coat check, feeling, for the first time in the entire 5-month investigation, the full physical weight of what I was about to do, and finding, underneath the weight, something unexpectedly steady. Not excitement, not fear, but the particular calm of a woman who has checked her work 11 times and knows, with total professional confidence, that the numbers reconcile. My father gave his remarks at 8:15, standing at a small podium near the head table, thanking the Rotary Club board, thanking 40 years of a marriage that's been the foundation of everything I've built, gesturing to my mother, who dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief in a gesture so theatrically rehearsed I nearly laughed. A genuine near laugh, the first spontaneous impulse toward humor I'd felt in weeks. He thanked my children, plural, generic, no names, the same erasure he'd performed at my grandmother's funeral, and raised a glass. The room applauded. I did not raise my glass. I stood near the back of the room, by the doors to the terrace, watching Chad work the crowd near the bar with the specific energy of a man networking connections he had no legitimate business exploiting. Watching Jessica laugh a half-beat too loud at something Marcus said to her from across a table where their spouses sat only feet away. Watching my mother accept compliments on the ice sculpture with the serene satisfaction of a woman who believed, that night, that she had gotten away with everything. At 8:52, I walked to the small stage where the string quartet had just finished a set, and I asked the club's events coordinator, a woman I'd spoken with twice already that week under the pretext of wanting to say a few words about my parents, whether I could have the microphone for a brief family toast. She said, of course, delighted, assuming exactly what everyone in that room assumed, that Elena, quiet, reliable Elena, was finally going to say something nice about her parents in public, the kind of gesture the family had always quietly hoped for and never quite gotten from me. I stepped up to the podium. I looked out at 211 faces, at my father's proud, expectant expression, at my mother already reaching for her handkerchief again in anticipation of more sentiment to dab at Jessica and Chad near the bar, at Marcus 3 tables back, and I began speaking in the same level, unhurried voice I used to open every expert witness testimony I have ever given. 40 years is a long time, I said, and I want to thank everyone here for celebrating my parents' marriage tonight, because it turns out this family has been very good, for a very long time, at celebrating things in public that don't hold up to any scrutiny in private. I watched my father's smile falter, not yet alarmed, still assuming this was some strange, uncharacteristic attempt at wit. 2 years ago, my father asked me to help restructure a family trust my grandmother left behind. I want to thank him publicly for that, because it's the reason I discovered that $410,000 was moved out of that trust, using 2 documents bearing a forged version of my signature. A forgery that a certified forensic document examiner has confirmed, using physical indentation evidence, was practiced 4 times on a single sheet of paper before it was executed convincingly enough to file. The room had gone silent in the specific way a room goes silent when 200 people simultaneously realize they are witnessing something they were not supposed to see. My mother's handkerchief stopped moving. Chad, near the bar, had gone very still. I want to also thank my brother-in-law, Chad Byrne, I continued, for introducing my father to a man named Foster Greco, whose real estate license was suspended in Florida for material misrepresentation in private lending, and whose company, Meridian Bridge Capital, used a $200,000 loan against my grandmother's trust as a vehicle to extract funds that ended up, variously, in a kitchen renovation, a Naples, Florida condominium my mother purchased without my father's apparent knowledge, and a Cadillac Escalade lease. Paying quote. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The acoustics of a silent ballroom carry a level, unhurried sentence better than any amount of shouting ever could. Agent Delacroix and 3 other agents, dressed for the occasion in dark suits that had, until that moment, made them indistinguishable from any other guest, moved from the terrace doors toward the head table with the unhurried, procedural calm of people who had done this exact walk many times before. And since we're celebrating honesty tonight, I said, my eyes finding Marcus, finding Jessica, I'd also like to thank my husband and my sister for the 14 months of text messages I've had time to read at my leisure, including the one where you both agreed I'm not built for the fun parts of life. I wanted you to know, in front of everyone who's ever admired this family, that I heard you. Jessica's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor, a sound that, in that silence, seemed to detonate. Marcus stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. My father found his voice first, too late, sputtering, "Elena, this is not the place." And I said, calmly, "You're right. It wasn't the place when you decided to steal from a woman with dementia. It wasn't the place when you forged my signature. But it is exactly the place for everyone in this room who's ever invested money because they trusted the Hale name to hear what that name actually means." Agent Delacroix reached the head table as I finished speaking, badge already visible, and said, in a voice pitched for the room rather than just for my father, "Richard Hale, Chad Byrne, I need you both to come with us. We have some questions regarding wire fraud and the exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Kane quote. The gasp that moved through that ballroom was audible, physical, a wave of 200 people simultaneously inhaling. My father tried, for a moment, the same tone he'd used on me my entire life. The warm, reasonable, "this is all a misunderstanding" tone that had worked on bankers and Rotary Club boards and his own children for 4 decades. And it did not work on Agent Delacroix, who had, unlike everyone else in that man's life, already read the 41-page forensic report and the wire transfer records and did not need to be charmed into believing anything. Chad, to his credit or perhaps his cowardice, said nothing at all, simply stood, his face gone the specific gray of a man doing rapid, panicked arithmetic on how much of this could still somehow not be his fault. My mother began crying, real tears this time. I could tell the difference after 34 years of studying the distinction. Not for what had been done, I understood watching her, but for the 211 witnesses to what had been done, for the specific, irreversible social catastrophe of her handkerchief-dabbing performance being replaced, in the memory of every person in that room, by federal agents leading her husband out of a country club ballroom in handcuffs. Marcus found me afterward, in the parking lot, as I was walking to my car alone, the sound of the ballroom's stunned chaos still audible through the doors behind us. He said my name. He said, "Elena, wait, can we talk about this?" in a voice that had, for the first time in 7 years, lost every trace of the easy charm that had once made my mother cry with relief at our engagement. I turned and looked at him, really looked, in a way I don't think I had allowed myself to in a long time. And I said, "There's nothing to talk about that a forensic accountant hasn't already documented. I have 14 months of messages, Marcus. I have location data, I have the Venmo receipts, I've had a folder with your name on it in my office for 2 months. What exactly is there left to discuss?" He didn't have an answer. I don't think, in 7 years of marriage, I had ever once seen him without an answer. And there was a strange, quiet satisfaction in that silence that I did not expect and have not fully stopped feeling, even now, telling you this. I'm going to tell you what happened to each of them, in the 11 months that followed that gala, because I think the specifics matter more than any vague satisfaction of, they got what they deserved. And because I spent 34 years watching this family avoid specifics whenever specifics might have been uncomfortable. I am done avoiding specifics. I built my entire career on refusing to. My father was indicted on federal charges 8 weeks after the gala. 2 counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343. 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder under the relevant Ohio statute, enhanced by federal jurisdiction, because the wire transfers cross state lines through Meridian Bridge Capital's Delaware banking relationships. And 1 count of forgery in furtherance of the fraud scheme, based on Priya Anand's report, which was entered into evidence and which the defense's own retained document examiner, after reviewing it independently, declined to meaningfully rebut, conceding in a pretrial hearing that the indented practice writing evidence was, in his professional assessment, difficult to explain through any innocent mechanism. My father's attorney pursued a plea agreement rather than risk trial, and 11 months after the gala, in a Cincinnati federal courtroom I sat in the 3rd row to watch, my father was sentenced to 4 years and 2 months in federal prison. Restitution ordered in the amount of $618,000, the full amount traced from the trust, plus interest and penalties, and a formal finding entered into the sentencing record that his own daughter, meaning me, had been the victim whose forensic work made the prosecution possible. The judge, a woman named Patricia Reyes who had clearly read the full case file, addressed my father directly before sentencing and said that in 22 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a case where the family member harmed had also been the one who uncovered the harm, unassisted by any investigator until she personally brought it forward. A sentence that landed in that courtroom with a weight I still feel sometimes, unexpectedly, in ordinary moments months later. My father is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in Morgantown, West Virginia, roughly 4 hours from where I live. I have visited him twice. Both visits were shorter than the drive there and back. He asked me, the second time, whether I could help him with an appeal. You understand these things better than any lawyer. And I told him, gently, in the same level voice I have used with him my entire adult life, that I was no longer available to help him with anything related to money, ever again, and that this was not a punishment, only a boundary, the first real one I had ever successfully held with him in 34 years. He did not understand the distinction. I don't think he ever will, and I have made a kind of peace with that. The same peace you make with a client who never really internalizes why the fraud they committed was wrong, only that they got caught. My mother's consequences were less dramatic on paper, and, in some ways, more thorough in practice. She was not charged criminally. The Bureau's investigation found insufficient evidence that she had direct knowledge of the forgery mechanism specifically, though the $94,000 transfer into the Naples condominium purchase was clawed back entirely through the civil restitution order. The condominium itself sold at a loss to satisfy part of the judgment, my mother's name on the deed dissolved by court order 8 months after the gala. What happened to my mother socially, though, was in some ways a harsher sentence than any the court could have imposed. The Camden Country Club Board, in a private vote 4 weeks after the gala, revoked my parents' membership, citing a morals clause I did not know the club's bylaws contained until my mother, calling me in tears, the 3rd time in our entire relationship I had heard her cry what I believed to be genuine tears, the first being at my engagement, the second being at the gala itself. Read me the letter aloud, her voice breaking on the phrase, "conduct incompatible with the values of the membership." Her book club, the one whose approval had organized so much of her identity for 6 decades, quietly stopped inviting her within 2 months, a fact she learned not through any direct confrontation, but through the specifically cruel modern mechanism of simply no longer receiving the group text with the meeting location. My mother sold the Foxcroft Lane house 9 months after the gala, unable to maintain it on what remained after restitution and legal fees, and moved into a 2-bedroom condominium 40 minutes outside Dayton, a downsizing so total and so public, in a social circle that had once orbited her lavish hosting, that she described it to me on the phone, in one of the only moments of what I believe was actual self-awareness I have ever heard from her, as starting to understand what it feels like when nobody's watching to see if you deserve anything. I did not gloat when she said that. I told her honestly that I hoped she found something real to build from it, because I meant that, even after everything. I have never wanted my mother's destruction, only her honesty, and I received, in that one sentence on the phone, more honesty than I had gotten from her in 3 decades combined. Chad Byrne fared worse than my father in the criminal proceedings, in part because the evidence of his prior relationship with Foster Greco established a level of premeditation and knowing participation that my father's attorney had successfully argued, in mitigation, my father himself lacked. The judge accepting the argument that my father, whatever his negligence and eventual willingness to forge documents once the scheme was underway, had genuinely believed at the outset that Meridian Bridge Capital was a legitimate lender, whereas Chad, per Foster Greco's own cooperating testimony, had structured the introduction specifically knowing the loan would be used as a laundering vehicle, taking a 12% finder's fee wired to an account in his own name that he had, with a carelessness that still strikes me as almost comic in retrospect, never bothered to disguise as anything other than a consulting fee in the very ledger I found it in during my first weeks of investigation. Chad was convicted at trial. He declined to plead, apparently believing until the final week that his charm might work on a federal jury the way it had worked on my father at that 4th of July barbecue, and sentenced to 5 years and 7 months, a term longer than my father's, with an additional restitution obligation of $112,000 representing his personal take from the scheme, an amount the court found he had already spent in its entirety on the Escalade lease, a boat he'd purchased and never once, as far as anyone could determine, actually used, and a failed investment in a friend's craft brewery that returned nothing. Foster Greco, whose cooperation with the Bureau had been secured in exchange for consideration on the unrelated Florida matters, ultimately received a reduced sentence of 2 years, having provided testimony not only in my family's case but in 3 other pending investigations into Meridian Bridge Capital's activity, involving other victims across 2 states. A detail Agent Delacroix shared with me some months later as a kind of grim vindication. My family's case, once it became a federal matter, had ultimately protected at least 6 other families I never met from suffering the same theft. A fact that mattered to me more than I expected it to, given everything else I'd lost in the process of uncovering it. Jessica's unraveling was slower and, in its way, more painful to witness than either the criminal proceedings or my mother's social exile, because Jessica's consequences were entirely of the relational kind. The kind courts don't order and restitution schedules don't calculate. Chad's arrest and eventual conviction left Jessica, within 4 months, functionally without income, since Chad's real estate career had never actually produced the earnings his lifestyle implied, and the marital assets, the house, the Escalade, even the boutique furniture Jessica had spent years curating for social media posts she used to make about our beautiful home, were largely seized or repossessed within the year. The house sold at a loss to satisfy a portion of Chad's restitution obligation. Jessica filed for divorce 6 weeks after Chad's sentencing, citing, "In the filing I only learned about because it became a matter of public record I encountered while researching an unrelated matter for a client, irreconcilable differences," a phrase that struck me, reading it, as almost comically insufficient for the actual differences in question. The affair with Marcus did not survive the gala either. Though not, I think, out of any genuine remorse on either of their parts so much as the practical impossibility of sustaining it under the specific glare that fell on both of them afterward. Marcus's own consulting practice, already barely solvent, collapsed within 3 months once my income, the income that had quietly subsidized 80% of his lifestyle for 7 years, was no longer available to cover the gap. Our divorce finalizing 4 months after the gala on terms that required almost no negotiation, since Marcus, faced with the full financial picture I had documented of exactly how much I had covered and exactly how little he had ever actually contributed, had no leverage left to negotiate from and no attorney willing to argue, given the paper trail, that he deserved anything beyond an even split of genuinely joint assets, of which there were, once you subtracted 7 years of my subsidizing his appearance of success, remarkably few. Jessica and Marcus did not, as far as I am aware, end up together, a detail I include not out of any petty satisfaction, but because I think it illustrates something true about the nature of what they had built. An affair sustained inside a family's larger architecture of appearances. Once that architecture collapsed and there was no longer a stable, resentful marriage to sneak around, no longer a family gala to attend together with their spouses none the wiser, seemed to lose whatever specific charge had made it feel, to both of them, like rebellion rather than simply what it actually was. Two people who found it easier to take from someone reliable than to build something of their own. Jessica moved in with our mother in the 2-bedroom condominium outside Dayton for 8 months, an arrangement I understand from Tyler, the only sibling who still occasionally speaks to me, was tense in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with two women who had spent their entire relationship as mother and favored daughter, suddenly forced to share a bathroom and confront, daily, the version of each other neither had ever had to actually live with before. Tyler's fate was, in the end, the one consequence I found myself least prepared for, because Tyler had genuinely never had direct knowledge of the fraud. His $1,800 allowance had simply arrived, monthly, without his ever once asking where it came from. In the same passive, unexamined way he had approached every material comfort of his entire adult life. When the money stopped, 6 weeks after the gala, once the Hale Family Ventures LLC accounts were frozen pending the restitution proceedings, Tyler was left, at 31, without income, without a place to live once the Foxcroft Lane house sold, and without, for the first time in his life, a single family member positioned to simply absorb the consequences on his behalf. He called me 4 months after the gala in a state I had genuinely never heard from him before. Not entitled, not sullen, but frightened, in the specific way of someone confronting an adult reality for the first time at an age when most people have had a decade's head start. I did not solve his problem for him. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it would have been easy, and even tempting, to slide back into the family role I had occupied my entire life, the one who fixes things. Instead, I told him about a training program at a manufacturing facility 2 towns over, a program I had researched, not out of some late-blooming maternal instinct toward my little brother, but because I genuinely believed, after everything, that Tyler deserved the chance to build something of his own from an honest foundation rather than another allowance he hadn't earned. He enrolled. He is, as of the time I'm telling you this, 11 months into steady employment as a machinist apprentice, the longest he has ever held a job in his life, and he called me 2 weeks ago, on my birthday, which he had never once remembered before, to say thank you. Not for money this time, but for refusing to give him any. My own life, in the 11 months since that gala, has taken a shape I could not have predicted even in my most private imaginings during the darkest weeks of that investigation, when I sometimes wondered, lying awake at 3 a.m. beside a husband I already knew I was going to leave, whether uncovering the truth would simply leave me with nothing at all. No family, no marriage, only the cold satisfaction of having been right. That fear turned out to be only half accurate. I did lose the family I had spent 34 years accommodating, and I did lose the marriage, and I want to be honest that there were nights in the 2 months immediately following the gala when the silence of my own house, no longer performing a marriage for anyone, felt less like freedom and more like a void I didn't yet know how to fill. But the void did not stay empty, and what filled it surprised me. Gerald Voss made me full partner at the firm 4 months after the gala, an elevation that had been under internal discussion for over a year, on the merits of my casework alone, but which he told me, with characteristic bluntness, he had accelerated specifically because a woman who can run an investigation into her own father with that level of discipline has earned every bit of trust this firm can offer her. The firm was renamed Voss, Kessler & Cross within the year, my name on the letterhead of the same firm where I had once sat in a folding chair near the door of a bank meeting, while my father took credit for a fraud I'd caught. I now run the firm's Forensic Litigation Support Division, a team of 14 associates, and I have made it a quiet, deliberate practice in every training session I run for new hires to teach the specific lesson my own family taught me without meaning to. That resistance to scrutiny is data, that the people most insistent you shouldn't worry about something are very often the people with the most reason to want you distracted, and that the coldest, most useful thing you can do with your own suspicion is not to panic and not to confront, but to build a file. My income, freed from 7 years of quietly subsidizing a marriage that had never been an equal partnership, has allowed me to do something I genuinely never expected to want. I bought a house 8 months ago, a modest 4 bedroom on a quiet street 40 minutes from where I grew up. Close enough to visit Tyler when he wants me to, but far enough that Foxcroft Lane, and everything it represented, no longer sits at the center of my map of the world. I have started dating again, cautiously, slowly, a process complicated by the specific vigilance a forensic accountant brings to every new relationship. A vigilance I've had to consciously soften in places, because not every person who takes a long time to explain where they were on a Tuesday afternoon is hiding an affair, and I've had to relearn, patiently, the difference between professional pattern recognition and simple, ordinary paranoia born of having been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect me most. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with my father, on my second and, I suspect, final visit to Morgantown, because I think it captures something true about how this story actually ends, which is not with triumph exactly, but with a kind of clean, sad clarity. He asked me, near the end of our allotted visitation time, whether I had ever loved him, whether any of what I'd done had come from love twisted into something else, or whether it had simply been calculation from the start. I told him the truth, which is the only thing I have ever really owed him, that I had loved him for 34 years, uncomplicatedly, the way children love parents before they're old enough to notice the accounting, and that the love hadn't disappeared so much as it had finally been forced to reconcile against the evidence, the way any honest ledger eventually has to reconcile against reality, no matter how much you wish the numbers said something kinder. I told him that loving someone and refusing to let them steal from you, forge your signature, and exploit your dying grandmother were not, in fact, mutually exclusive positions, and that the tragedy of our family was never that I stopped loving them. It was that loving them had always, silently, been priced as compliance, and I had simply, finally, stopped paying. I haven't told you enough about my grandmother yet, and I think I owe her more than a passing mention, because in a very real sense, this entire story started with her, and because the specific cruelty of what my father and Chad did to her memory deserves to be understood in full rather than reduced to a line item in a restitution order. Eleanor Hale was 81 years old when the Second Meridian Bridge Capital Financing Agreement moved funds against her trust using my forged signature. And by then she had been living at Brookmere Assisted Living for just over 2 years, diagnosed 14 months earlier with vascular dementia that had progressed, by the final year of her life to the point where she sometimes did not recognize my father, her own son, on his visits, though she recognized me, consistently, until nearly the end, a fact I have never fully understood and have stopped trying to explain, except to say that perhaps the 200 Sunday afternoons I spent with her, reconciling her Social Security statements against her nursing home bill, cross-referencing every charge against her actual care plan, to make sure Brookmere wasn't quietly overbilling a woman who could no longer check her own accounts, built something in her memory that outlasted almost everything else. Eleanor had built the original $2.3 million trust herself, in 2011, from proceeds of selling a small chain of hardware stores she and my grandfather had run for 30 years before his death, stores she had kept running alone for the 11 years after he passed, refusing every suggestion that she sell early and retire, telling anyone who asked that she wanted to leave something real behind for her grandchildren, not just a company that had already, by then, been handed to my father. She specified, in the original trust documents I reviewed personally as part of building my case, that distributions were to be made in equal thirds to Richard's children, Elena, Jessica, and Tyler, upon my death or upon unanimous agreement of the trustees before then. A document that named me, specifically, first among equals, a detail I did not fully register the significance of until I was sitting across from Priya Anand's forensic report months later, understanding that my own father had needed my signature specifically because I was named, alongside my siblings, as a co-trustee whose consent the original document required for any restructuring, consent he had decided, at some point, was easier to forge than to actually ask for and risk being refused. The forensic exploitation charge Agent Delacroix's team pursued required establishing that my father knew, at the time of the second and third distributions, that Eleanor's cognitive capacity had deteriorated to the point where she could not meaningfully consent to or even understand the restructuring being done in her name, and the evidence for that knowledge came, devastatingly, from my father's own visitation log at Brookmere, which showed he had visited her 4 times in the 18 months preceding the second financing tranche, each visit logged by staff with brief notes on her condition that day. confused about time of day, did not recognize visitor initially, agitated, asked for deceased husband, notes my father had access to as her son, an occasional visitor, notes that established, in the prosecution's argument, that he had known precisely how little capacity his own mother retained to consent to anything, and had proceeded anyway, comfortable in the knowledge that a woman who could no longer track her own Social Security statement would never be positioned to challenge a financial restructuring she didn't understand was happening to money that was, by the trust's own terms, no longer fully his to restructure. Eleanor died 5 months before the anniversary gala, in her sleep, at Brookmere, with only me present, my father having left 20 minutes earlier because, he said, he couldn't watch her like this. A sentence I have turned over many times since, wondering whether some part of him even then understood, dimly, that he could not sit with the consequences of what he'd already begun doing to her trust, while looking at her actual face. I held her hand for the final hour. She did not speak by then in full sentences, but she said my name twice, clearly, in that hour, unprompted. A fact the hospice nurse noted with some surprise given how little verbal communication Eleanor had produced in the preceding weeks. I have chosen to believe, though I have no forensic evidence for this belief and would never present it as fact in any professional capacity, that some part of her understood, even then, who among her grandchildren she could trust to actually see her. Hale Precision Tooling, the company my grandfather built from a single lathe, did not survive my father's arrest intact. The bank that had extended the company's operating line of credit called the loan within 6 weeks of the news becoming public, citing a material change in the company's ownership and leadership stability, and without my father available to run daily operations, without capital to bridge the gap, and with the company's own books revealing, once regulators and auditors finally looked closely, years of the same casual mismanagement that had made Chad's fraud so easy to disguise as ordinary business borrowing, the company filed for Chapter 7 liquidation 9 months after the gala. 41 employees lost their jobs, a fact that weighs on me more than almost anything else in this entire story, because those 41 people had nothing to do with my father's forgery or Chad's scheme, and yet they were the ones who ultimately absorbed the most direct, immediate consequence of it, no severance beyond what bankruptcy law minimally required, no warning beyond the standard 60-day notice. Careers built over decades at a company whose name had meant something in that town for 2 generations, ended by decisions made in rooms those employees never entered. I have, in the months since, quietly funded, through a mechanism my attorney structured to avoid any appearance of guilt-driven publicity, a modest transition assistance program administered through the county's Workforce Development Office specifically for displaced Hale Precision Tooling employees, not because I owe a debt for my father's crimes. My attorney was very clear that I do not, legally or morally, but because I believe, the way I believe most things, based on evidence. The evidence of what 41 families lost, through no fault of their own, deserved some response from someone in the family whose name had been on that building for 60 years. I saw Jessica once, alone, in the 7 months following the gala, an encounter neither of us planned, at a pharmacy counter in a shopping plaza neither of us usually frequented, which is perhaps exactly why it happened at all. 2 people who had spent their whole lives circling each other inside a family structure, suddenly meeting by accident in a neutral, unstructured space, with no dinner table, no mother to manage the temperature of the room, no husband standing nearby pretending not to listen. She looked different than she had at the gala, thinner, in the specific unglamorous way that comes from stress rather than discipline, her hair a shade darker than the highlighted blonde she'd maintained religiously my entire adult life. A maintenance regimen, I now understood, funded in part by the same stolen trust money that had built her kitchen's stainless appliances and her husband's boat. She saw me before I saw her, and for a moment I watched her decide whether to duck down an aisle, and then, apparently, decide against it. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, which struck me as an odd opening, since forgiveness was not a transaction I had ever offered or withheld from her explicitly, only a thing she seemed to assume. Correctly, I had quietly decided not to extend. I told her honestly that I didn't think about forgiveness much anymore, that what I thought about instead was the specific 8-month period during which she had asked me, at family gatherings, whether I'd look over documents and tax strategies for her and Chad while simultaneously sleeping with my husband, and that I found the compartmentalization required to do both of those things at once more disturbing, in a clinical sense, than the affair itself. She didn't have an answer for that. She said, eventually, quietly, standing near a shelf of cold medicine, I think I convinced myself you'd be fine. You always were fine. You never seemed to need anything from anyone, so it felt like it wasn't really taking anything from you. I told her that this was, in fact, the precise mechanism by which every fraud in this family had operated for 11 years. The assumption that because I did not perform need loudly, I did not have any, and that this assumption had cost me a marriage, a trust, and a family. And that I hoped, for her own sake more than mine, she eventually understood the difference between someone who doesn't need anything and someone who has simply never once been asked what she needed. She started to cry, in the pharmacy, over-the-counter cold medicine on the shelf beside her, and I did not comfort her, and I did not feel cruel for not comforting her. I simply paid for my prescription and left. Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, called me 3 weeks after the gala, the first family member outside my immediate parents and siblings to reach out, and her call surprised me, because Carol had always occupied a peripheral, uninvolved position in the family's dynamics, present at gatherings but rarely weighing in on anything substantive. She told me she'd been unable to sleep properly since that night, replaying the moment my father's face had changed at the podium, and she wanted me to know, in her words, "I always thought something was off about how your parents talked about you, Elena. I just never said anything, because it wasn't my place, and I regret that now more than almost anything." I told her I appreciated the call, and I meant it, though I also noted, in the same clinical part of my mind that never fully stops running its background analysis, that "it wasn't my place" was a sentence I had heard, in one form or another, from nearly every adult in my extended family across 3 decades. A chorus of bystanders who had each individually decided that witnessing an imbalance did not obligate them to name it, and that the sum total of all those individually reasonable decisions to stay quiet had been, functionally, a system that protected the people doing the harming far more effectively than any single person's silence could have on its own. The federal trial against Chad Byrne, which proceeded to a full jury verdict rather than a plea, required me to testify for nearly 6 hours across 2 days, walking the jury through the same forensic timeline I'd built for Agent Delacroix's investigation: the UCC filing, the Wayback Machine cache of Greco Capital Partners' old website, the wire transfers, the finder's fee, the pattern of Chad's monthly advisory retainer that had never produced a single documented piece of actual real estate advice in the company's files. The defense attorney, a sharp, aggressive litigator from Columbus, spent nearly 90 minutes on cross-examination, attempting to establish that my testimony was motivated by personal animus rather than objective forensic analysis, a line of questioning I had anticipated and prepared for extensively with Gerald, who had coached me, correctly, that the strongest answer to any accusation of bias is simply to let the documentary evidence speak for itself, rather than getting defensive. When the attorney asked, pointedly, "Isn't it true, Ms. Cross, that you have a personal vendetta against your brother-in-law?" I answered, "I have 41 supporting exhibits and a forensic document examiner's report. I'd invite you to tell the jury which specific finding in either you believe is inaccurate, rather than asking me how I feel about Mr. Byrne personally." The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all 4 counts. Marcus's mother, Linda Cross, the same woman who had once declared my own wedding not nearly grand enough for a cross, despite her family's actual net worth being a fraction of what mine would eventually become, called me twice in the month after the divorce finalized. Not to apologize, I quickly realized, but to ask, with a bluntness that almost impressed me given the circumstances, whether I might be willing to help Marcus get back on his feet, just as a kindness, given everything you two built together. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that what Marcus and I had built together was, upon forensic review, almost entirely funded by me, and that I had already spent 7 years being a kindness to her son at a cost I was only now fully able to calculate, $412,000 across the marriage by my own conservative accounting, and that my capacity for further kindness in that specific direction had been fully exhausted. She did not call a third time. I understood, hanging up that second call, something about the particular way appearances-obsessed families recruit each other across bloodlines, the Crosses and the Hales operating on nearly identical logic despite never having much liked each other personally, both families fluent in the language of deserving, of legacy, of who owed whom a kindness regardless of who had actually done the work. And I felt, for the first time, a kind of relief at being fully outside both of their orbits at once. Gerald Voss, in the months after the trial concluded, told me a piece of his own history I had never known in 9 years of working under him, Offered, I think, because he wanted me to understand that the instinct that had let me build this case wasn't something I'd invented under crisis, but something he'd recognized in me from the very first interview, a recognition rooted in his own past. Gerald's own father, it turned out, had been investigated and eventually convicted of embezzling from a family-owned insurance agency in the 1980s. A case Gerald, then a young man just starting his career with the Bureau, had specifically recused himself from working on, watching from a distance as other agents built the case that sent his father to prison for 3 years. I understand something about what you did that most people in this field never will, Gerald told me over coffee in his office one evening after the rest of the staff had gone home. Everybody thinks the hard part of a case like yours is the forensic work. The forensic work is the easy part, Elena. You've been doing forensic work since you were 24. The hard part is deciding, every single day for months, that the truth still matters more than the version of your family you're going to lose once you tell it. I did not have a response to that for a long moment. It was, I think, the single most accurate description anyone had ever offered of what those 5 months had actually cost me. More accurate than anything I had managed to articulate to myself. I want to say something now about the specific, quiet re-education I underwent, in the months after the gala, regarding my own worth. Because I think it's the part of this story most viewers considering their own families might actually need to hear. More than the mechanics of forensic accounting, or the specifics of federal sentencing guidelines. For 34 years, I had operated on an unexamined equation, that love, in a family, was earned through usefulness, through reliability, through the specific unglamorous labor of being the one who reconciles the ledger, watches the children, catches the $9,000 bookkeeping error, and asks for nothing in return beyond the occasional acknowledgement that never actually came. I had accepted, without ever consciously choosing to accept it, that my function in that family was structural rather than beloved, a necessary load-bearing wall rather than a person anyone particularly wanted to sit next to at dinner. It took losing that entire structure, watching it collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty, to understand that a family built on that equation was never actually a family in any sense worth preserving. It was a ledger, and I had simply, finally, closed the books on an account that had been running a deficit against me since the day I was born. The house I bought 8 months ago sits on a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees that turn a specific, deep red every October, a detail I noticed the first time I walked the property with the realtor and thought, with a small, private ache I didn't examine too closely at the time, that the color reminded me of nothing at all connected to Foxcroft Lane, which had always been landscaped in a manicured, deliberate way that left no room for anything as unruly as a tree simply doing what it wanted in autumn. I furnished it slowly over months, choosing pieces one at a time rather than all at once, a process my interior designer friend from law school found almost comically deliberate, not understanding that for me, the slowness was the point. For the first time in my adult life, every object in my home reflected an actual choice I had made, rather than an accumulation of things acquired to satisfy someone else's sense of how a household should look. I started seeing someone 6 months after the divorce. A structural engineer named David Okonkwo, 41, divorced himself, with 2 teenage daughters he shares custody of on alternating weeks. A man I met, appropriately enough, through a mutual colleague at a professional networking event neither of us particularly wanted to attend. What I noticed about David first, before I noticed anything about his appearance or his conversation, was the specific, small habit he had of asking follow-up questions about things I said, rather than waiting for a pause in which to redirect the conversation back toward himself. A habit so unremarkable to most people, I imagine, and so genuinely novel to me that I found myself on our 3rd date, quietly cataloging it the way I might catalog an anomaly in a ledger, trying to determine whether it was performance or pattern. 11 months later, I can report, with the same forensic confidence I bring to any other long-term analysis, that it is pattern. David does not know the full details of my family's story, beyond what became a matter of public record and local news coverage when the trial concluded. I have told him the outline, not the granular texture I'm sharing with you now, but he has never once, in 11 months, made me feel that my vigilance, my instinct to verify rather than simply trust, is a character flaw he's patiently tolerating, rather than a reasonable response to what I actually lived through. I want to tell you about a case I worked 4 months after the gala because it gave me a strange, clarifying mirror to hold up against my own family's collapse. A woman named Patricia Nakamura came to Voss, Kessler & Cross after discovering that her adult son had been siphoning funds from her small business's payroll account for nearly 2 years. funneling the money through a shell vendor relationship, disturbingly similar in structure to Meridian Bridge Capital, though on a much smaller scale, $81,000 rather than $400,000. Patricia sat across from me in my office, describing her son's excuses, his charm, his ability to make her doubt her own bookkeeping instincts every time she raised a concern, and I recognized, listening to her, almost every beat of what I had lived through myself, down to the specific phrase her son had used. "Mom, you worry about this too much, let me handle it." A near verbatim echo of what my own father had said to me. I built her case in 6 weeks rather than 5 months, partly because I had, by then, refined the exact methodology, and partly because I found, working late in my office on her file, a specific, useful channel for something that might otherwise have curdled into bitterness. The knowledge that the pattern I'd survived in my own family was not unique to my own family, that it was, in fact, a recognizable, documentable architecture of exploitation that repeats across households with depressing regularity, and that I was now, professionally and personally, uniquely positioned to help other people recognize it before it cost them what it cost me. Tyler and I have dinner every other Sunday now, a ritual we started 4 months ago, at my house rather than any family table. Just the two of us, no performance required for anyone else's benefit. He told me, at the most recent one, that he'd been promoted at the manufacturing facility, moved from apprentice to a junior machinist role with a modest raise, and that he'd started, on his own initiative, without any prompting from me, putting $50 a week into a savings account, the first savings account he has ever maintained in his adult life. He said, almost shyly, that he wanted to pay me back for a security deposit I'd helped him with when he first moved into his own apartment, an offer I initially waved off, until I recognized, watching his face, that refusing the offer would replicate exactly the dynamic our family had run on for decades, Elena absorbing the cost so nobody else had to feel the discomfort of an honest transaction. And I told him instead, yes, I'd take $50 a month until it was paid off. Not because I needed the money, but because he needed, for the first time in his life, to know what it felt like to owe someone something and pay it back in full. The story became local news within days of the gala, first through a brief item in the Dayton Daily News about a prominent local businessman facing federal fraud charges, and then, once my father's name and the specifics became public record through the indictment, through a more detailed piece that ran with the headline, "Family Fortune, Family Fraud, Local Manufacturer Accused of Exploiting Own Mother's Trust." I did not speak to any reporter for that first piece, and I have generally declined interview requests in the time since, with one exception, a local business journalist named Renata Voss, no relation to Gerald despite the shared surname, who approached me 4 months after the gala not for a sensational family drama angle but specifically to write about the mechanics of the fraud itself, the UCC filing trail, the shell company pattern, as a cautionary piece aimed at helping other small business owners and family trust beneficiaries recognize similar red flags before they became victims themselves. I agreed to that interview on the record because it served a purpose beyond my own story, and the piece that resulted has since, according to Renata, become one of the most read cautionary finance features her publication has run in 3 years. Cited twice by local elder law attorneys in continuing education materials about recognizing financial exploitation of aging parents. The reaction from our broader social circle, the network of Rotary Club members, country club acquaintances, and extended family friends who had known my parents for decades, split in a way I found both predictable and, in certain individual cases, genuinely surprising. Several of my father's longtime business associates, men who had golfed with him for 20 years, distanced themselves within weeks, one going so far as to have his assistant call my father's attorney to formally request that Richard Hale's name be removed from a scholarship fund the two of them had co-established a decade earlier, a request granted without objection given the circumstances. But I also received, unexpectedly, a handwritten letter from a woman named Eleanor's old next-door neighbor, a woman named Ruth Bellwether who had known my grandmother for 40 years before her death, thanking me specifically for what she called finally telling the truth about what that family did to a woman who couldn't defend herself anymore. A letter I keep. Still, in the same manila folder tradition I've relied on my entire career, except this folder, unlike the others, contains nothing anyone will ever need to prosecute. Only a reminder that somewhere outside my immediate family, people who had actually loved my grandmother recognized what I had done as an act of care rather than an act of vengeance. I have thought a great deal in the months since about the distinction between justice and revenge, because I know some viewers of stories like this one want a clean, satisfying narrative of a wronged woman getting even. And I want to be honest that what I feel looking back is not quite that. Revenge, as I understand the concept, is about the satisfaction of the person delivering it, a settling of an emotional account for its own sake, regardless of whether the underlying facts support any particular consequence. What I built over those 5 months was something closer to an accounting, in the most literal sense of the word, a precise, documented reconciliation between what had actually happened and what everyone in my family had, for years, insisted was happening instead. I did not decide my father's sentence. I did not decide Chad's restitution amount. I built a case, handed it to people with the actual authority to determine consequences, and then I stood in a ballroom and told 211 people the truth, in a level voice, without embellishment, because the truth, when you have documented it thoroughly enough, does not require embellishment to land with its full weight. If that produces something that resembles vengeance in its aftermath, I have made my peace with that resemblance, because the alternative, staying silent, protecting a family narrative that was never actually true, allowing my grandmother's exploitation and my own forged signature to simply be absorbed, quietly, into the family's operating mythology the way every other injustice I'd witnessed for 11 years had been absorbed, was never something I was willing to accept again, once I understood what I was actually looking at. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with losing a family you were never actually fully inside of to begin with, and I want to name it here because I don't think it gets discussed often enough in stories like mine, which tend to move quickly from wrongdoing to triumphant reveal to tidy epilogue. The grief I carry is not primarily for my father's absence, or my mother's diminished social standing, or even for the marriage that ended. It is for the version of a family I spent 34 years hoping might still be possible. The version where the accommodation I offered so consistently might eventually be reciprocated, where being useful might eventually convert into being cherished, where the ledger might one day balance in my favor without my having to force the reconciliation myself. That version of my family never existed. I know that now, with the same forensic certainty I bring to every completed case file. But knowing it, and having documented exhaustively precisely why it never existed, does not fully erase the specific ache of having wanted it for so long, and I think that ache, more than any single piece of evidence I gathered, is the truest thing I can tell you about what this entire year actually cost me. Agent Delacroix's team, in the months following my father's and Chad's convictions, identified 6 additional families across Ohio, Kentucky, and Florida who had been targeted by Meridian Bridge Capital using structurally identical schemes. A retired schoolteacher in Lexington whose late husband's Veterans Benefits Trust had been drained by nearly $90,000 through a nearly identical bridge loan arrangement. A small manufacturing family outside Louisville whose patriarch, like my own father, had been introduced to Foster Greco through a trusted personal connection who turned out to have a prior undisclosed relationship with him, and 4 smaller cases involving individual retirement accounts rather than family trusts, all following the same basic architecture of legitimate-seeming collateral, plausible-seeming loan terms, and a laundering mechanism disguised as ordinary business expense. I was asked by the county prosecutor's office to consult briefly on 2 of these related cases, providing forensic methodology guidance to investigators who had not previously encountered the specific UCC filing trail technique I'd used to first identify Meridian Bridge Capital's structure. And I agreed on both occasions without billing my usual consulting rate. Because by then, I understood my own case not as an isolated family tragedy, but as one data point in a pattern that had already cost real families real money for years before it ever touched mine, and would likely have continued indefinitely if nobody had ever built the file thorough enough to expose the mechanism rather than just the individual transaction. The county prosecutor's office, in the aftermath of my father's sentencing, approached me about participating in a community education initiative aimed at elder law attorneys, financial advisors, and adult children of aging parents, teaching a condensed version of the red flag recognition framework I'd developed, resistance to transparency as a data point, shell company registration patterns, the specific vulnerability created when a family member with financial credentials is deliberately excluded from oversight of exactly the assets most at risk. I have now given that presentation 4 times, to audiences ranging from 40 to over 200 people, and each time, without fail, at least one attendee approaches me afterward, quietly, to describe a version of their own family's version of Loop A, a sibling handling an aging parent's finances with suspicious opacity, a family investment opportunity that nobody outside the immediate decision makers is permitted to examine closely. A pattern of exclusion from oversight that maps, with uncomfortable consistency, onto the exact architecture my own father and Chad built around my grandmother's trust. I have come to understand, doing this work, that my family's fraud was not an aberration born of unique cruelty. It was a common, replicable pattern executed by ordinary people who convinced themselves, one rationalization at a time, that what they were doing wasn't really theft. Just as my father, I believe even now, has never fully allowed himself to understand that forging his own daughter's signature 4 practice attempts deep constitutes anything other than an unfortunate, regrettable shortcut around a bureaucratic inconvenience. I have also, in the past several months, begun the process of establishing a small nonprofit, still in its early organizational stages, aimed at providing free forensic consultation to families who suspect financial exploitation of an aging or vulnerable relative but lack the resources to hire a firm like Voss, Kessler, and Cross at commercial rates. Gerald has agreed to serve on the board. Agent Delacroix, now approaching his own retirement from the Bureau, has agreed to consult on cases that may warrant federal referral. I do not know yet how large this effort will become or how many families it will ultimately help, but I know that the specific isolation I felt during those 5 months, building a case against my own father essentially alone, with only Gerald's guidance and Priya's forensic expertise standing between me and the overwhelming, disorienting experience of discovering your entire family's public narrative was a fabrication, is an isolation I would like fewer people to have to navigate without support. And I have decided, in the specific, deliberate way I decide most things now, that building something useful out of what happened to me is a better use of the knowledge I've gained than simply moving on and letting it fade into a story I tell at dinner parties. My last substantive conversation with my mother happened 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday afternoon, in the small living room of her 2-bedroom condominium outside Dayton, a space so much smaller than Foxcroft Lane that her furniture, moved from the old house, sat crowded and slightly too large for the room. An oversized sectional pressed awkwardly against a wall that couldn't quite accommodate it. A visual metaphor I don't think she intended, but that I noticed immediately and have not stopped thinking about since. A woman surrounded by the physical remnants of a life sized for a grander stage than the one she now occupies. She had asked me to come, specifically to talk, and I went, because despite everything, I have not entirely closed the door on my mother the way I have on my father. A distinction I've examined in myself and attribute, honestly, to the fact that my mother's crimes were ones of complicity and cowardice rather than active forgery. A distinction that matters to me morally, even if it wouldn't have mattered much to a federal prosecutor. She told me, sitting across from me with a cup of tea neither of us drank, that she understood now, in a way she hadn't let herself understand before, how differently she had treated her children, and that she wanted to know if there was anything she could do to begin repairing what she'd broken. I told her the truth, which is that I did not know yet, that 34 years of a specific pattern does not repair itself through a single conversation, no matter how sincere, and that what I needed from her, if anything, was not a grand gesture, but a sustained, boring, unglamorous consistency, the same kind of consistency I had offered her, unasked and unreciprocated, for over 3 decades. I told her that if she wanted to start, she could start by asking me, the next time we spoke, an actual question about my life that wasn't preceded by a request, and see how that felt, sustained over months rather than a single afternoon. She has, in the 3 weeks since, called twice, and both times she asked about David, about the new house, about a case I was working on, without pivoting once into a need of her own. It is a small thing. I am aware it is a small thing. But I have built an entire career on understanding that patterns, not single incidents, are what actually predict outcomes, and 2 consistent data points, however small, are the only kind of evidence I have ever trusted enough to act on. The maple trees on my new street turned that same deep red again 3 weeks ago, marking, without my quite planning it that way, almost exactly 1 year since the anniversary dinner where my father told me I didn't belong with my own family. I stood in my driveway on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, David inside making breakfast for his daughters who were staying with us that weekend, and I found myself doing something I don't think I had done in over a decade. Simply standing still, without a folder to build, without a case to trace, without a family dynamic to manage or accommodate, just standing in a driveway I owned outright. In a life built entirely from choices I had actually made rather than roles I had been assigned. Watching leaves fall onto a lawn that belonged. unambiguously and without any hidden ledger attached, to me. I want to tell you about one specific memory from childhood, because I think it explains, more efficiently than anything else I could describe, exactly how a family builds the kind of architecture that let all of this happen decades later. I was 9 years old. It was the summer my family took what was, at the time, considered our biggest vacation ever, 2 weeks at a rental house on Lake Erie. And on the fourth night, my parents hosted a dinner for two other families they'd befriended at the marina. An evening of adult conversation and grilled corn and citronella candles on a deck overlooking the water. Jessica, 13 at the time, had been allowed to stay up for the dinner, seated at the adult table, contributing precocious observations about a book she was reading that made the marina families laugh warmly and tell my mother, "She's just delightful, Diane." I had asked that same afternoon whether I could stay up too, and my mother had said, distractedly, arranging a charcuterie board, "Elena, sweetheart, maybe next year, you're still a little young for grown-up conversation." A sentence that would have made perfect sense on its own, except that I was only 15 months younger than Jessica, a gap that had never once, in any other context, been treated as developmentally significant. I remember sitting at the kids' table that night with Tyler, who was 4, eating hot dogs while the adult table's laughter drifted through the screen door, and I remember, with a specificity that still surprises me given how young I was, doing something that I now recognize, with the full benefit of 30 years of forensic training, as my very first act of pattern analysis. I counted. I counted how many times, across that entire 2-week vacation, my mother introduced Jessica to the Marina families by name and by some flattering detail. "This is my daughter Jessica, she's just started dance team," versus how many times she introduced me the same way. Jessica 11 times, each with an accompanying detail. Me 3 times, each simply, "And this is Elena," no detail attached. As though my existence required acknowledgement but not elaboration. I did not have language, at 9, for what I was noticing. I only had the number, 3 against 11, sitting in my stomach like a fact I couldn't yet do anything with, and I remember thinking, with the strange premature gravity children sometimes access before adults expected of them, that I would need to find some other way to matter, since being introduced with a flattering detail did not appear to be a category of attention available to me. That is, I believe now, the exact seed from which everything else grew. The decision, made at 9 years old on a lake house deck, that if charm and warmth were not currencies I would be permitted to spend, I would find another currency instead, and the currency I found was competence. Being the one who noticed the citronella candles were running low and refilled them without being asked. Being the one who helped clear the adult table quietly while Jessica remained seated receiving compliments. Being the one whose worth, from that summer forward, I began constructing entirely around usefulness rather than around the simpler, more dangerous hope of simply being liked for existing. I built a version of myself, over the following 25 years, so thoroughly competent that my family stopped noticing competence was a performance at all, mistaking it for my personality, rather than recognizing it as the specific adaptive strategy of a child who had done the math, at 9 years old, on exactly how much attention she was likely to receive, and decided to earn what she could not simply be given. I told that lake house story to a new associate at my firm 2 months ago, a 26-year-old named Priyanka Desai, who had come to me privately, after hours, to ask how I managed to stay emotionally steady while auditing families whose dynamics reminded her, she said carefully, of things in her own life she hadn't fully examined. I told her the story of the citronella candles and the count of 11 against 3, not because I expected it to solve anything for her, but because I wanted her to understand that the instinct to notice imbalance, to count rather than simply feel vaguely uneasy and move on, is not a cold or clinical trait to be ashamed of in this work. It is, I told her, the exact same instinct that eventually let me build a case thorough enough to survive a federal courtroom, and the earlier a person learns to trust that instinct rather than talk themselves out of it, the less time they spend, as I did, accommodating a pattern for 11 more years than the evidence ever actually warranted. Priyanka has since become one of the sharpest associates on my team, and she still, occasionally, texts me a single word, counting, when she's caught herself starting to rationalize away a red flag in a case file. A shorthand between us now that I find, unexpectedly, one of the more meaningful professional relationships I've built since everything happened. David and I spent this past Thanksgiving together, the first major holiday I have hosted since the divorce, and I want to describe it because it stands, in my memory, as such a stark contrast to every Hale family Thanksgiving I have ever attended, that the difference itself feels like part of the story's ending. I cooked, but David cooked alongside me. Not performatively, not as a gesture designed to be praised later, simply because he enjoys cooking, and assumed, correctly, that a shared task was more pleasant than a divided one. His daughters, 16 and 14, set the table, and when the older one, Amara, asked whether she could invite a friend whose own family situation was, David explained quietly to me beforehand, complicated and painful that year. I said yes without a beat of hesitation, without calculating what accommodating an extra guest might cost me in labor or attention, a calculation that would have consumed several minutes of anxious math in my old life. Tyler came too, sober, on time, having offered unprompted to bring a dish rather than simply arriving and eating what someone else had prepared. A small gesture that meant more to me than I expected, given how many decades of the opposite behavior I had absorbed as simply how my family operated. We sat at that table, 7 of us including Amara's friend, and at one point David raised a glass and said, simply, "To the people who show up," a toast so unadorned and unpretentious compared to my father's rehearsed anniversary remarks, that I felt something settle in my chest I don't have a precise clinical term for, something that resembled, as closely as I can describe it, the specific relief of finally exhaling after holding a breath for so long you'd forgotten you were holding it at all. I want to go back to one specific night, because I think it's the actual hinge point of this entire story. More than the gala, more than the dinner at Bellamy's, more even than the moment I found Priya's forensic report confirming the forgery. It was a Tuesday in late July, the night I finally allowed myself to fully believe, rather than merely suspect, that my father had forged my signature. And I remember exactly where I was, sitting alone in my car in the parking garage beneath my office building. Engine off, because I had just spent 40 minutes at my desk laying the 2 disputed signatures side by side under a desk lamp. Using nothing more sophisticated than my own trained eye and 11 years of professional experience reading questioned documents, and I had known, with a certainty that made my hands genuinely unsteady for the first time in the entire investigation, that I was looking at a forgery of my own name. I sat in that parking garage for over an hour, and I want to describe honestly what went through my mind, because I think the temptation in that moment is exactly the temptation this genre of story usually skips past, in favor of getting straight to the satisfying reveal. My first impulse, sitting there in the dark, was to drive directly to Foxcroft Lane and confront my father immediately, to stand in his kitchen and demand an explanation before he had any chance to prepare one. An impulse driven by a kind of raw, uncomplicated fury I had genuinely never felt toward him before in 34 years, not even close. I actually started the car. I actually pulled out of the garage and drove 4 blocks toward the highway that would have taken me to my parents' house before I made myself pull into a gas station lot and sit there instead, forcing myself through the same discipline I apply to every professional case. What happens if I confront him now, with nothing but my own eye and my own certainty, and he simply denies it, destroys whatever remaining physical evidence exists, coaches Chad and my mother on a unified story before any investigator ever gets involved? I would have burned the single advantage I had, the advantage of being the only person in that family who knew, definitively, what had actually happened, while everyone else still believed their fraud remained undiscovered. I called Gerald from that gas station parking lot instead, at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, and I remember the specific, steadying quality of his voice when he answered, half asleep, and I said, without preamble, "Gerald, I think my father forged my signature on trust documents, and I need you to talk me out of driving to his house right now." He didn't say much in that first call, only, "Don't do anything until Monday. Come see me first thing. Whatever this is, it deserves to be built right, not fast." And then, after a pause, "And Elena, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough right now, but I am. I drove home instead of to Foxcroft Lane." I lay awake next to Marcus that entire night, already knowing about the affair by then, too, though the 2 discoveries had not yet fully merged into the single, complete picture I would have by September. And I remember thinking, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., that the version of myself capable of waiting 5 more months to act, capable of building a case slowly and correctly, rather than detonating everything in a single furious confrontation, was the exact same version of myself my family had spent 34 years training into existence without ever once intending to. They had built, through decades of demanding patience and accommodation from me while extending none in return, the single most disciplined, most patient adversary they could possibly have created, and it took every bit of that discipline, forged in exactly the family that would eventually need to survive its consequences, to make sure that when the reckoning finally came, it came in a form nobody could talk their way out of. There is a detail from the divorce proceedings I haven't mentioned yet that I think matters, because it captures something about Marcus specifically that the gala scene alone doesn't fully convey. During mediation, 4 months after the gala, Marcus's attorney attempted to argue that I owed him a form of ongoing spousal support, citing the disparity in our incomes and the length of the marriage, a position that required, functionally, ignoring the $412,000 in documented subsidy I had provided across 7 years to sustain a consulting practice that had never once been profitable. I sat across the mediation table from Marcus, watching him avoid my eyes while his attorney made this argument, and I produced, calmly, the same kind of exhibit binder I would produce for any other case. 7 years of bank statements, categorized and cross-referenced, showing exactly how much of our joint household expenses I had covered relative to his contributions, alongside his own business's tax returns showing gross receipts that, in 5 of the 7 years, did not exceed $30,000 against expenses of over $80,000. The mediator, a retired family court judge with decades of experience, looked through the binder for perhaps 90 seconds before turning to Marcus's attorney and saying, without any particular emotion, "I think we can move past the spousal support question." Marcus's attorney did not raise it again. Marcus himself said nothing for the remainder of the 4-hour session beyond what was legally required, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him had genuinely believed, right up until that binder hit the table, that I would simply absorb this cost the way I had absorbed every other cost across 7 years, because absorbing costs without complaint was, in his understanding of me, simply a fixed feature of who I was, rather than a choice I had been making, deliberately, every single day, and had finally, permanently, stopped making. The final weeks before the gala were, in some ways, the strangest of the entire investigation, because I had to continue performing an entirely ordinary domestic life alongside a man I already knew. With certainty, I was going to leave. In a house I already knew, with certainty, I would need to sell or buy him out of, while simultaneously coordinating with Agent Delacroix's team on warrant timing and reviewing, one final time, every exhibit in a case file that by then ran to over 300 pages. I remember one specific evening, 8 days before the gala, when Marcus suggested, unprompted, that we should do something nice, just the two of us, feels like we haven't connected in a while, and took me to dinner at a restaurant we'd gone to on our first date 7 years earlier, an evening that, from his side of the table, I believe was a genuine, if guilt-driven, attempt at reconnection, and that from my side of the table was an exercise in maintaining a composed, unremarkable exterior while carrying, silently, the complete architecture of an ending he did not yet know was already fully constructed. He held my hand across that table. He told me, that night, that he loved me, in the same easy, practiced voice he'd used to tell Jessica, in a text I had already read, that I was fine, but not built for the fun parts of life. I said I loved him too. It was, I want to be honest, not entirely a lie. Some residual, habitual affection for the version of him I'd married still existed somewhere underneath everything I'd learned, but it was also, unmistakably, the single most calculated sentence I said to another human being in that entire 5-month investigation, delivered with a steadiness that still, looking back, surprises even me. I think often about the specific moment, during my testimony at Chad's trial, when the prosecutor asked me to explain, in plain terms for the jury, how I first became suspicious that something was wrong with the trust. I could have given a simple answer, a discrepancy in the account balance, a K1 that didn't match expectations, and left it there, because that answer would have been true as far as it went. Instead, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned, something that came out of 11 years of professional habit before I'd fully thought through whether it belonged in a federal courtroom. I noticed because noticing discrepancies is the only skill this family ever consistently rewarded in me, and I had simply never before turned that skill on my own life. The prosecutor, I could tell, hadn't expected that answer either, and there was a brief pause in the courtroom before she moved to her next question. But I saw, in the jury box, at least 3 jurors write something down, and I understood, watching them, that the sentence had landed as something more than forensic testimony. It had landed as an explanation of exactly how a family manufactures the very tools that will eventually be used to dismantle it. If it pushes the person holding those tools far enough, for long enough, without ever imagining she might one day point them inward instead of only ever outward on its behalf. I don't know, even now, whether my father fully understands what he lost beyond the prison sentence and the restitution order. I suspect he understands the financial and legal consequences with total clarity, because those are quantifiable, documented, the kind of loss a man like him has always been equipped to measure. I suspect he understands far less clearly, if at all, the specific thing he actually forfeited the day he practiced my signature 4 times on a single sheet of paper.